Coming to you live from Bismarck, North Dakota, San Diego, California, Bakersfield, California, and Waukesha, Wisconsin, by way of Philadelphia, is the Constitution and American Life with the Friends of Publius. We are very excited to begin our fourth year of providing assistance, insights, and thoughts to students of America's Constitution from across the nation, using the Center for Civic Education's We the People, the Citizen, the Constitution program as our guide. In this episode, we will be addressing observations on the Philadelphia Convention, its conflicts and compromises, as well as the feasibility of a contemporary convention to address America's current problems and ills. Our reference is from Unit 2, Question 2, We the People State Questions. Before we begin our discussion, I would like to introduce a new component of our program, and that is the FOP discussion question of the day or week or month, whenever students, teachers, you want to have the discussion. But I'm hoping that we can provide, some ideas of important discussions that aren't necessarily related to our topic that we might be discussing in our program today, but that we believe that every student in America's constitutional system of government should consider. We hope that you discuss with your class, your friends, your unit mates, your parents, anybody out there. And so our question of the day for this episode is, does democratic government require one person, one vote? If so, does the United States qualify as a healthy and accessible democratic system of government given the United States Senate, the Electoral College, and gerrymandering? Hopefully, we'll come back to you in a week or so with maybe our thoughts on that, but that's your question of the day, week, or month. So let's begin our discussion here on the Philadelphia Convention with our resident expert, Professor Tim Moore from the Center on the Study of the Constitution at the University of Wisconsin. Tim, first of all, let's make sure I understand Madison's observation. He said that the convention must have enjoyed an exemption from the, I'm not even going to try this, pestilential? What pestil?
Good, yeah.
Pestilential influence of party animosities, the diseases most incident to deliberative bodies and most apt to contaminate their proceedings. That is a mouthful, all right? I.e., it seems that he's observing to some degree it's a love fest. Probably an overstatement there, but I'll go that way. I'm wondering, from your perspective, doesn't the American experience with early state constitutions provide evidence that there was existing factional party tension within the American Republic at the time that the convention was called? And if so, isn't it therefore logical to conclude that Madison was full of hyperbole and misrepresenting the convention?
Yes and no. Given you're right, David, it is naive to assume that there wasn't factional politics before the convention. I mean, shoot, there's a couple of really great books out there about the factions within the Revolutionary Continental Congress. Holy cow. Depending on the issue, these coalitions would align, and they weren't permanent coalitions too, depending on the issue, funding the war, supplying requisitions, whether they should have foreign assistance. There were all kinds of issues that really divided the Continental Congress. Certainly the first state constitutional systems had factions. I mean, in Massachusetts, you had these two factions that would go back and forth and came to a head over Shays, whether they should be pardoned, and Bowdoin and Hancock. Hancock was a master tactician, decided not to run after the Shays because he didn't want to be in the position to pardon them. So you have the Hancock Bowdoin faction in New York. You have the Clintonites and the Schuyler family, and those are and the Clinton is a machine. Maybe I would argue one of the first political machines. And again, Pennsylvania, the Constitutionalists and the Republicans, tremendous back and forth in Pennsylvania politics in the 80s. So yeah, I mean, it is. So I mean, to the question, like, okay, why would Madison, paint such a rosy picture of the convention? Well, I think, I'm in the unenviable position to defend Madison, I guess here. I
Or at least
think
try to explain it.
no, 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 no. I think given his background in the Articles Congress, when nothing gets done, many days they don't even have a quorum. There's hardly any legislation that comes out. The attempts at amending the articles all fail, all six of them. So I think in some regards, the summer at Philadelphia there is kind of a breezy event compared to how tedious Articles Congress was. I also think, I mean, let's be honest. I mean, here, uh, given the nasty nature of the '80s, where Rhode Island's leading the pack in debt relief, debt forgiveness, actually. Um, you also have there's a great book we've mentioned before. There's just way too much democracy in the '80s, and Madison writes an internal memo kind of summarizing a lot of his problems with how volatile, and it's interesting in Fed 37 how the negative words he uses, pestilential. I mean, Federalist 37 is full of just it is hyperbole to describe how uh, how unruly this democratic experiment was in the first 7-8 years. Um, you know, he's also he's I think he's kind of trying to put pick lipstick on the pig. He knows in the middle of the summer some New York delegates leave because they're not happy. He knows at the end of the convention that there are three non-signers, Mason, Randolph, and who am I missing? Mason, Randolph, and Gary, Elbridge Gary. So I think in part he is kind of, but should we consider the Federalist Papers any more than op-ed pieces? He's trying to sell the folks in New York, send people that are favorable to the Constitution, send them to our New York State Convention. So I think there's an element of a sales job there.
So I was wondering kind of because today we talk about people living in bubbles, all right, information bubbles, news bubbles. And given what I understand about newspapers and communication in the 18th century, there's some similarity, right? There were Republican, or Federalist newspapers and anti-Federalist
Yeah.
newspapers. So I guess my question is, I mean, does Madison really believe that people are going to buy this notion, all right, in this Federalist paper? If there are in fact people in New York, who know for a fact that it
Right.
wasn't this love fest.
Well, sure. I mean, and he's in New York at this time where they're writing all these Federalist Papers. They're cranking them out pretty quickly, and so yeah, is he in a bubble? Well, I don't know that Madison's in a bubble because he keeps his ear to the ground pretty well, and he proves that in the '90s when he basically um, keeps his ear to the ground when he's in Congress, and he basically sets up the first political party system under Jefferson's tutelage, I guess. But I think the people are in an information bubble, and this is a part of the anti-federalist critique. There's way too many Federalist editors. So I think the people might be in an echo chamber, although there's plenty of people that don't have access to papers that are talking in pubs and sermons and over the fence posts and what have you. So I don't I have my doubts that there's an information bubble there, and certainly not one in his case because he's in and around Congress there in New York.
So, Professor Kavanaugh, I'm wondering if, and I was thinking about this, if maybe one of the factors that Madison's, referencing or not referencing, but is maybe if indeed this is true, what Madison is saying, maybe one of the factors that made me wonder here is, was there kind of an imbalance of those who were sent to the convention as delegates? That is, were the overwhelming majority of these delegates already set up to be Federalists or pro new constitution with a stronger central government?
Well, I'm going to go back and jump in and finish up with Tim. By the way, the book you mentioned, he didn't say the title of the book is Woody Holton's Unruly Americas. I think that's what you're alluding to,
Yeah.
Tim.
Yeah.
Really excellent. There it is. Thank you. Oh, there you go. Look at that. Professor Williams on top of it. And I think if you read the rest of the quote from Fed 37, because he says, well, people, hey, people, they agreed with it, so they must like it. Well, that is a lot of lipstick on a pig, right? Because two New Yorkers, Lansing and Yates, they leave, right? And they're already bad mouthing. They're already bad mouthing what's going on there. And obviously, Tim mentioned the three kind of heavyweights that don't sign it. So I'm going to, as much as I love little Jimmy Madison, and my God, plowing through Fed 37. So it's a slog. But the one part in Fed 37, just as an aside, that I really like is he talks about the limits of the human language. He's trying to explain how, we're trying to separate out these branches of government, but because we're using our language, and even if Almighty God came down and speak to us, in his infinite wisdom, if he's using the English language is so imperfect, we may not be able to understand him. It's like, what? But I think he's definitely kind of a sales job, in which the Federalist Papers are in a way a sales job, because that there are people there that don't support things, and we know, and I think the students will find out through their course of study that, my goodness, when they get to the debates over representation, that almost sinks the whole thing. I mean, one of my favorite quotes is from Franklin, who he writes it and has Wilson read it, about, we were not sent here to contend with each other. And if you already have a fixed opinion on things, and I'll share the link to this in the show notes. But if you show up with a fixed opinion and you're not willing to listen, then we're already sunk. So there was some serious, debates, representation, designing the office of the presidency. So when he's writing these last few lines in Fed 37, it's like, oh, well, it was, man, we were sitting around, making s'mores by the campfire, singing Kumbaya. It was all great. It wasn't all great. So, but he's trying to convince people. But to your question, David.
And I'm surprised, Chris, you didn't mention, because there's one great rebuttal to this Federal's hyperbole. It's a letter that he writes to Jefferson on October 24, 87. You talk about a total opposite view of the convention. It's like an 8-page letter, and most of it is, it's a failure. So there is a great rebuttal by Madison himself about the convention.
Well, I think we know that, as the students will find out, and teachers will find out, is because, as we've said on other programs, Madison he gets less than 50% of what he wants.
Yep.
So I mean, he learns the art of compromise to, and which goes to David's question, I think, because you end up with these delegates from every state with the exception of Rhode Island. It's always Rhode Island, but so was it an imbalance towards people that were going to favor the Constitution? I don't think so. And actually, for the students, and I learned this through Tim and John Kaminsky, his boss, when people were voting in the states to send delegates, there were no property requirements. You're still a white male for voting, but when you're voting to send your delegates to the convention in Philadelphia, there were no property requirements to vote to send those people. Is that right, Tim?
Yep.
So, you talk about, David, your leading question about democracy. That was, some small d democracy early on. So I think that is going to provide for more balance. We see that, obviously Madison, gives his Virginia plan to Randolph, and Randolph presents it. And obviously, small states get pretty apoplectic about that. And they come back with Patterson's New Jersey plan. So there's a lot of debate. So I don't know that, it was the outcome was predetermined based on the folks that are showing up in Philadelphia. But I think what
I'll
it does
push.
show, and then
I'm
just
sorry.
what it does show though is their willingness to try something. So even though they know the articles are not working, there are serious issues, and students you'll be getting into that in Unit 2 for sure. Um, they were not afraid to try something. And if students and teachers, you guys know you do group work, and the person that comes up with the first plan, that's becomes your foundation, and that's what you work off of in your group project usually. Well, that was Madison and the Virginia plan, and they go from there. So I don't think so, David. But Tim, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'll push back a bit on that. I've often said I'll push back for two reasons. Well, one's a general statement. They're all nationalists at the convention on a spectrum. Everybody knows that they've been, I mean, their instructions, every state instruction says go change the articles, amend or alter.
Necessary for the exigencies of the
Right.
Constitution.
Well, there's the big caveat, right? But my thesis statement is they're all predisposed to be stronger national government folks. And even the folks that leave, Lansing and Yates, they were actually probably involved along with Luther Martin and Gary and Patterson of writing the New Jersey plans. But you also look at the New Jersey plan. I mean, I skimmed it over this afternoon. There's a lot of national power. There's a lot of pro-national government stuff, even in the New Jersey plan. Article 2 is a huge verbal change that's significant. Instead of having requisitions for funding, they use the word levying taxes. There's a world of power differences in the proposed, even the New Jersey plan, to levy taxes rather than request requisitions. They're advocating for a national judiciary. They're advocating for a national executive. The treaty proposal in the New Jersey plan is quite a pro-national government because it says it's the supreme, it'll be the supreme law of the states. Now, that's a powerful national government statement. So I think we often look at the New Jersey plan in juxtaposed to the Virginia plan. I'm recommending look at it in relationship to the articles. And so that's why I say I push a little bit on Chris. They're all nationalists. Now, by the end, we've gone too far.
Well,
to some of them we've gone.
For some of them, right. Right.
Yeah, well, that it goes back to, I think, I'm not sure how this plays out here, but you're referencing Madison's letter to Jefferson, and right in October 24, and where he's like, this is nothing what I wanted. So I don't think these guys, back to David's question, were these guys presupposed? Were they nationalists? Yeah, absolutely. But were they presupposed to go as far as Madison wanted to go?
No,
clearly
right.
not. Yeah, clearly not.
Right.
So, Tim, assuming, well, in fact, the students are asked to deal with some of that there is contentiousness there. So if we look at the sources of what tension does exist, to what degree is the contentious nature or the tension that exists in Philadelphia, to what degree is it sourced geographical or economic or ideological? Or all three? It's just a conglomeration of a lot of things, or can we separate those out into some kind of political science chart here?
Oh my!
Silos, put them in categories, right,
but
Mike?
Of course, we can put them in silos. It's just whether they. Well, the answer is yeah. There's all of that. Now, I tend to be less. I tend to say, look, I look at the economic and more often the geographic as being, I'll focus on those a bit more than I would ideology, because I think Chris has said this over and over and over again in these programs, and some of these programs, they know they've got to get something that can be approved. They know they have to have popular approval of this thing. So ideology having said that, ideology is going to be tempered. I mean, if you want a highly ideological plan at the convention, it's Hamilton's. Holy buckets, very ideological, very hard line, and no one, it's a non-starter.
Well, I
So,
think the current Supreme Court might like it.
well, they might, yeah, or yeah, right.
Sorry.
So ideology, I'm a little less prone to say put it on the equal plane with the geography and the economics. I know Beard. There's a whole cottage industry out there. Was Beard right or was Beard wrong? I think I was at a lecture once somewhere where the professor says, you know, everything after Beard is trying to either prove him or disprove him. So he's ground zero in this whole discussion about how much economics drove the considerations. And he did a wonderful thing. He checked their portfolios. Now, by the time we get to the 1940s, there's some historians that kind of taken Beard to task. So I think the heart of his argument hasn't been totally gutted, but pretty close to it being solely an economic exercise there in Philadelphia. But the fact that they have a contract clause, you know, basically the national government's in charge of the economy. So there is an economic component here, and that economics is what they were trying to achieve at economic policies, what you're trying to do at Mount Vernon as well as Annapolis. So to deny that there isn't any economics there is a fool's errand. But I think, in my estimation, Beard overestimated that. But it is there. The other piece, geography, I think is really important, especially the West. Everybody at Philadelphia knows that the Mississippi River problem in the 80s was huge. The national government needed to gain control of that, because otherwise the West would be lost to either Spain or Great Britain. They're also concerned about, they're getting information about the Northwest Ordinance, how that's proceeding through the Articles of Congress. So the West plays a huge role in, I think, the deliberations at Philadelphia, more so. If I have one beef about Unit 2 is it tends to be very ideological in describing the convention, as well as ratification, whereas I think there is ideology there, but I wouldn't overestimate it. But yeah, all of it's there, David.
Chris?
I'm going to jump in because this is really our first show for this year, so we have new students. So Tim's referencing Charles Beard, who is a very famous historian that came out in the 1920s to say that the Constitution was merely an economic document, which of course flies in the face of the great man history that people want to hear, but it's really worth reading and examining, as Tim was pointing out. The other thing, we kind of chuckled because Professor Williams is a political scientist, and we tease him a little bit about political scientists wanting to put things in silos or categories.
A little bit.
So,
a little bit.
A little bit. So for the students, that's why we're kind of doing that. And the third thing is, I don't think you can separate geography from economy, because I think that sectionalism is tied
Slavery.
together.
Well, yeah, but I got to ask you guys, beyond slavery. All right, clearly slavery has a geoeconomic perspective there, but beyond slavery, is it accurate to say that all the New England states geographically have the same economic interest, or the middle states, that because of their location, they have the same economic interest? Is that accurate or reasonable, or is there differentiation?
I'll say this, and so Tim or Mike can slap me around. But I think it's more, I want to go more urban and rural. I think there's an issue when you have a port city like New York City, you have a city like Philadelphia. I think there's the idea you have an urban rural split. Of course, obviously, urban, a city of maybe what, 500,000 people. But I think that's more of the split as opposed to a regional split. But as we mentioned, slavery as well.
Yeah.
So, Professor Williams, welcome you to Unit 2 here. And again, looking forward to your silos.
Good to be here. It's good to be here.
Or you could try to compete with Professor Moore on the spectrum analysis if you'd like, but you can stick to your silos here. But one of the things that the students are asked to address is the idea, which, by the way, is less far-fetched today than it was 30 years ago, quite possibly, the idea of a constitutional convention here in the 21st century. And what I'm wondering is, would the challenges of holding a convention today, would they be pretty much the same challenges they had in the late 18th century, or would there be some differentiation, do you think?
Yeah, I think there would be some similarities and some differences. And then I think we can talk about at the state level how this has played out, because this may reflect on what we could then scale up to the federal. But I mean, the first two ideas I have are purely process, and this is probably really obvious. But there were factions in 1787. If we hold a convention today, there are going to be different factions, and there's going to have to be compromise, right? So those two kind of process things, I think, would be similar. I also think that some of the enduring questions from 1787 would continue to show up today. So I'm thinking about, how strong should the central government be? I don't think there is a consensus on that. And I think a lot of these debates that were happening in Philadelphia, we would have them again if we were to have a convention 21st century. And the same idea just about rights and the nature of rights and which rights should be protected and not protected. But with that all said, I do think there are many more differences today than there would be. The fact that there are political parties, well, yeah, the fact that there are political parties means that it adds to polarization. It adds to sort of the hardness of these factions, I guess. The role of media is going to be very different. There's no way in the 21st century that we would pull off having a convention with the kind of secrecy and the lack of media presence that they were able to get away with in 1787. And it's also like we now have these 250 years of an experiment that we could draw from in the United States and globally, right? I mean, one of the things I think that the founders were dealing with is that they were kind of trying to learn the lessons from Greece and from Rome and then from the individual states, but there was no scaled up model about how what they're trying to create would work. And I think that those things would come to play as well. And then, I didn't realize this. Students, think about this. I found that there are 14 states that in their constitution mandate that every 10 years or 20 years that the voters have a right to vote on whether they want to have a state constitutional convention. And the only state that has done so since World War II has been Rhode Island in 1986, right? Most recently, Alaska in 2022, the citizens of Alaska, I mean, they got a vote. Do you want to hold a state constitutional convention? And in 2022, Alaska said no. I found that Iowa 10 years ago, or no, 20 years ago, in year 2000, they called a specific constitutional convention on the funding of public schools. And out of that came a change in the Constitution where they allowed local counties, if they wanted, to have a sales tax of 1% to support their schools. And that passed, and that has changed when I was reading. Many, many counties in Iowa now have taken advantage of that to then raise taxes for public schools. So I think that tells us something maybe where we're at culturally as a country. If these populations in these states have an opportunity, right, and they're saying no, well, what does that tell us? And I think it may tell us a couple things. I think that the unintended consequences of having a convention scare so many people that they would rather just keep what we have because they're worried about opening up that Pandora's box and seeing what would come out of that. So it's safer for, I think, the entrenched elites just to keep things going the way they are.
So on one of the things you said, Mike, I'd like to follow up on, and you said that there's a consistency there, and that is the kind of the fundamental question about the role of the central government being, again, that was at the at the forefront in 1787, and you'd argue it would be so today. But I am wondering if it would be somewhat different, because it seems to me that today that question is really about, in some ways, about policy issues. That especially the new Trump Republican Party there are many issues in which they're advocating a very strong central government there. Abortion might be one of them. It's hard to tell with Mr. Trump where he is on any given day, but we know where many leaders of the Republican Party are regarding a kind of a national law to regulate health care, or denying health care, one might argue. So I'm wondering, to what degree were these issues in the 18th century policy oriented? All right, are they more policy oriented today than they were back in the 18th century there? And that might be something that you address, Mike. And Tim, I saw a physical response from you as well.
Yeah, okay, I'll take a crack at this. I mean, do we think of the existence or non-existence of slavery as a policy issue or a broader cultural issue? Do we think of taxation, right? That's definitely a policy issue. Here's what I don't know. So I'll throw this out there, and Tim and Chris, you can correct me on this. What's in Project 2025, whether Trump and Vance want to stand by it or not, it does envision a very strong state in terms of what I would say kind of like republicanism, right? A moral vision of how America should be. And some have called it called Project 2025, a post-liberal document. Not only what they want to do with abortion, but definitions of family, the role of education. It's very much, I think, what we think of in terms of what small r Republicans would think of. So having that debate today would cut along so many different lines, right? Because I think you're going to have the states' rights folks, but you are going to have this new strand of, has America lost its way over these last 200 years? And do we need a strong central government to sort of get us back to our moral foundations, whatever you may think they are? And I'm not sure, this is where Chris and Tim can help me out. I'm not sure that in 1787, those types of debates were happening about creating some sort of moral supremacy. I don't know, a moral vision of the United States. I don't know if that was part of the discussion or not.
Well, I think, I mean, I look at a lot of the issues that drove folks to Philadelphia. Those were policy issues. Tariffs, taxes, the West. I mean, sadly enough, slavery was not an issue that was much on their mind until they got to the representation piece. But slavery as a moral issue got very little discussion unfortunately, at the convention. So I think, I guess, David, I would say that I mean, doesn't policy always drive people to conventions?
Well,
I mean,
I guess the
whole Article 5 movement is about a balanced budget. So I mean, there's a policy issue there.
Well, I guess my question is are people going to be consistent in their view about the role of the central government, throughout their policy preferences? I mean, that's where, to me, it breaks down, is when you say you're opposed to a strong central government, and then you look at taxes, tariffs, slavery, trade, those kind of issues of the 18th century. And today, I don't see a consistency of less central government in the Trump Republican Party. All right. And I'm just wondering, I guess, Tim, is there a consistency amongst the anti-federalists, if that's what we want to use, in their opposition to a strong central government across all those policy issues?
Yes, if you're assuming all anti-federalists are ideological. Most, I mean, this is kind of I don't know if it's pet peeve, but there's a whole lot of anti-federalists that could care less about particular ideologies. They're all about maintaining, it's less ideological in their mind. It's all about, keeping my job, preserving my political, fiefdoms. And so so in other words, there are anti-federalists that are ideological. I'm not denying that, but your question kind of assumes every anti-federalist is ideological in the way they think. I think that's the way I read the way I read it. That's a tough argument to make, that everybody is thinking ideologically.
So, Professor Williams, I'm wondering, how contentious do you think, in this hypothetical, contemporary constitutional convention situation, how contentious do you think representation would be? That is how states would choose. And again, help me out, Professors Moore and Kavanaugh. Was it real contentious in the 18th century as far as representation, or was it was just simple? Was it simple popular vote, or did state legislatures? Was there a contentious debate within states of how representation to the convention would be decided?
No, because they're all white guys.
Well, but so it's a moot point, Chris. But they basically took the Articles, the Confederation model of representation. You can send up to 7, although Pennsylvania sent Franklin at the last minute because you got to send the guy. So you can send up to 7, but come to a final vote, you got to pool them into 1. So they basically model the Articles representation scheme, as well as a lot of debate rules that they had. They were borrowing from the Articles as well as state legislative traditions. I mean,
So
if
how
that's
well do you
your
think that
question.
would work out, Mike, today? How contentious do you see representation to this convention being?
Put that one in a silo.
Yeah, right. No, I think it would be even more so than in 1787, just because there's so much more that we could debate about. I mean, we have an experience of what it's like for 2 senators from each state. We have, there's this movement now among some states for ranked choice voting. There's a notion of the role of political parties. I mean, the founders weren't even thinking about how political parties might factor into representation. So I think if that were to be on the agenda, it would be even more contentious because you would have your entrenched interests, right? You'd have folks making the same arguments they were making in 1787, big state, small state, but a lot of people aren't going to buy that. But then do we have yes, I think it would be even more because we have more models to choose from.
I'm just wondering, I mean, again, you call a convention, I'm assuming there has to be kind of a due date. All right, you have to have your delegates decided by this date because we're holding the convention, July of 2026. And I'm thinking there's a number of states that wouldn't be able to get their work done by the due date because of the contentiousness surrounding representation there.
Well, they didn't get all the states. Well, Rhode Island never shows up, but a couple of states do show up, late.
Well, there's a great exercise in Unit 2, I think, for students and for teachers that who would we send today to a convention, right? Do we send politicians? Do we send political scientists like Professor Williams or historians like Professor Moore? Or do we send provocateurs like Professor Richmond? Do we?
Yes.
Does everybody need to be represented? I mean, to we talk about identity politics. That'd be a very difficult thing. But ultimately, too, for students to remember, no matter who you send to the convention, it still has to be ratified. So even though we send some really, smart, good-looking guys like those other 3 guys on this panel, it still has to be ratified by the folks, right? So, there is a backstop.
Right. So kind of building off of this, Professor Kavanaugh, it seems to me that one of the reasons, and again, I may be way out of bounds here, but it seems to me that one of the reasons that the delegates in 1787 were successful, all right, was the rule of secrecy, in that they were somewhat protected from the outside world, and they took kind of an oath not to be gossiping out there. I don't know how effective that oath was, but generally speaking, there was this secrecy rule that the delegates had to abide by. And I'm wondering, do you think that secrecy rule would be necessary for a current convention, and that we could even impose a blackout of media coverage of the convention in 2024, 25?
People would lose their minds. They would lose. I mean, you think about people today that run wild with conspiracy theories today because of lack of transparency, right? The whole concept of, sunshine is the best antiseptic. I think people would lose their minds today if we try to do that. And plus the fact, on the other side, depending on who we send, to this hypothetical convention, if we send current politicos who live for the soundbite, right, on their media of choice, that would be very difficult. And I think it would be very difficult because we don't have a George Washington. I think Washington was key here in the fact that the general, shows up thanks to Madison. I mean, Madison kind of throws him under the bus, which is hilarious. I mean, that's 6'2" versus 5'3". But he shows up and immediately he's president of the convention and he lays down the rules. And these guys, they revere Washington at this point. He's kind of like, you got to be really careful about going after Washington. So when he says, this is what we're going to do, we're going to do it. There's this story about, someone had been taking some notes and they come into the next day, I'm going to paraphrase this story. And Washington has these notes that got left on the table, somebody's table. And he said, gentlemen, that we agreed that we're not going to let this out to the out of doors here. So whoever, notes for these, you can come forward and claim them. Nobody comes forward to claim them because they don't want the wrath of Washington. So I think that was, in addition, David, to your point about secrecy. And by the way, John Comiskey, Tim's boss, has a great, are we going to put that in the link to that, Tim, in the show notes? A great pamphlet on the rules of the convention, which talking about secrecy. And it was a fantastic resource to address Dave's excellent question. So could we do that today? No, I don't think we could.
You don't think, Chris? I'm just wondering because we have built in, and I'll use the term secrecy because was in the question. But we have institutions that do that all the time. Your school board. I'm sure by law, there's certain subjects that they don't hold in public forums, especially if they're personnel subjects. All right, at least that's state law in California.
Right.
The Supreme Court holds things, outside the realm of public observation. National security meetings are done now. So you don't think that you could get, once this is decided, a small group of people to explain to the American people and to media, listen, we're going to be doing this and we're going to be holding it without media attention, without public attention, and nothing's going to leave the room, but you're going to see the final product and you're going to have a say on it. You don't think that would quiet the,
Oh my gosh.
this is rare. I'm going to agree with Chris, because people
Write that
will
down, kids.
lose their minds. I mean, look at David, you're right. There are these entities that do secrecy, but think about the numbers you just read, the numbers. I mean, 55 cats in Philadelphia. If we had a convention, it's going to be one heck of a lot more than 55. And there's no way with that large a body of people, first of all, practically to get it done. And secrecy is, it seems to me, only successfully operable when you reduce the numbers involved in the discussion. So I think there's a representation piece that may run counter to the your hope that we could do this.
Mike?
Well, I mean, I'm going to take Dave's side on this. I mean, I just think
somebody better check the stars.
No, I just think, to me, the key is to what extent do people fear so much that they're willing to take the outcome? I mean, we just went through this. I mean, the whole Kamala Harris presidency was made in secrecy. Right? We've turned into a parliamentary system. We've replaced one leader and we've shrunk the election to 3 months, right? And people were like clamoring that first couple of days, but what happened? Everyone just now is on board and there's nothing the other side can do about it. So I do think that there is a model for it. I wouldn't be in favor of it. I mean, I think it goes, I'm a big believer in that process, but I think that once you don't have that, then I think the whole effort is just, it's just not, you're not going to get it resolved. Like, I think the secrecy is necessary, but I'm not arguing for the secrecy. I just think that Dave's right. There are models for it. And I think that's
I think the secrecy is necessary too. I would agree. I just don't think we can do it today. And my example would be, let's see, Speaker of the House Johnson, appointed a bipartisan committee to investigate the assassination attempt on former President Trump. And he's got some hardline Republicans on there, and you got some Democrats on there too. And they went to Butler County, Pennsylvania. But now you have members of his own party that are their own investigation because they don't trust their own Speaker of the House and members of their own party to be forthright. And that's what they've said. They think that there's we live in such a conspiratorial thinking times that, and with the media that we have today that is so profit driven, so could we have people that meet in secret? Those people possibly could, depending on who we send. But like Tim said, to get that representation, that's going to be a much larger group than 55 dudes in Philly, right? And the fact that there are going to be a lot of people pounding on the windows and pounding on the doors and then throwing all kinds of aspersions on what's happening there. So I don't think that, could we do it? Possibly. Could it be successful? No. I struggle with the idea of it being successful.
Well, I will look forward to hopefully hearing from testimonies from kids who will jump on board and take you to task on that, Professor Kavanaugh. There, Professor Williams, our final question for this evening might reveal, I guess, my Americanist credentials here and how narrowly tailored my knowledge is. But I was thinking, when we think about this concept of a convention, of people to form or reform or amend governments, at least as an American, it's all about the United States. Yet conventions, to my knowledge, are fairly rare, in American history. We've got the original one there in 1787, and you've brought up the notion of states, being able to do that as well, although they're not real frequent themselves. So I do wonder, given that fact, is this notion of a convention to make these big decisions a particular American idea, or is it universal in the democratic universe, or a universe of democratic governments?
I wouldn't say it's universal, but I would say conventions have become common in the mid 20th century and the early 21st century. And I think this American exceptionalism, or just only knowing America's history, France had 3 conventions between 1792 and 95. They 3-timed us, right there. Canada had a convention in 1864. So there's South Africa had a very famous convention in the 1990s. But as I was thinking through this and looking at the examples of the conventions, there's some similarities about when they happen, right? Are you a former colony that is now getting your independence, right? Most of that has happened in the mid 20th century after these norms of democracy are kind of well rooted in the world, which was not the case in 1787. So conventions were very much a way that those places transitioned. Places where there was just so much violence that all the elites realized we have to change something, right? South Africa had a civil war for 15 years before Mandela was released, and there was a consensus amongst whites and blacks that the system had to change, and the default was a convention. There's a couple of interesting examples. Iceland held a convention in 2010 to revise their constitution because of the financial crisis. Their findings were not adopted by the public, but that was a very much of a crisis orientation, right? So I think there's something to it. And I think what I was saying before, I think Americans would have to get to a point where they realize things are so fragile, things are so bad, that the unintended consequences of how this might turn out, that risk is better than us kind of living through what we're doing right now. And I don't think we're at that point, but I think that is the trigger for these conventions in a way that we've seen in the 20th and 21st century. And
Mike,
none of
I had a-
them model the United States, by the way. They're not looking at us and picking up how to do
right,
it.
right. Did South Africa, how many people were at that convention in the 90s? A couple hundred?
Um, more, thousands, and taking public.
Wow.
Now, there were the top decision makers who were taking that
Yeah.
information, but it was very much, it had to be sold in this post-Cold War period. It had to be sold as an open process, especially when Mandela was leading one of the delegations, and Mandela was nothing but a former, former felon.
Yeah.
Doing it, didn't have any political power.
So most of the students we're talking to today and in the next 10 weeks or so, you're new to the program. One of our traditions here is to end every episode, every segment that we present with final thoughts from our panel of scholars on the question that students will be dealing with here in Unit 2, and maybe some insights and recommendations that they might make. So we'll start tonight with Professor Williams. Thoughts, recommendations about Unit 2, Question 2 on conventions, past and present.
Yeah, I think it's pretty easy from looking at from 2024 back and just being maybe critical of the way the convention was held in Philadelphia, given our standards and norms today. And I would just have students to really immerse themselves not on just on what happened in Philadelphia, but the issues we've tried to get at today, like what was happening in the States and in the United States before that? What were the fears of foreign powers? What was the unquestioned issues about the West? And put it in that historical context of what we were doing then and the decisions being made. It doesn't mean that everything that was decided there was right, or the decision that we would make today, but I think it's important to appreciate the significance of what was accomplished at that period with all of the things going on around them and around the world at the time.
Professor Kavanaugh.
Kind of dovetailing with Mike, I appreciate what he said. Students, you'll find out that we were really careful when we talk about history, not to straight line it to today, because there is no straight line to today. Mike makes a point to pay attention to what were the issues at the time which led to the convention in 1787. You can't, there's just not a straight pipeline from 2024 back to 1787 and so it's just like this, just like that. It's not. There are differences, and this is why we're struggling with the issue about who would show up at a convention today. So be careful about making that straight line there, and understand this too. This is true about everything in terms of history. The convention, the success of the convention, the success of ratification was not inevitable, right? We tend to think sometimes, well, of course they're going to have a convention. Of course they're going to write this document. Of course we're going to call Madison the father of the Constitution. No, none of that was inevitable. That took real people with political skill to see those things through. But there are similarities to today to then, but you can't draw that straight line. And don't be afraid, students, to push back on Madison, to push back on the Federalist Papers. We did a little bit of that at the beginning with David's questions. So don't be afraid to maybe push back on that a little bit.
Professor Moore?
Yeah, I have two thoughts. One is kind of connected to what Mike was saying about look at other conventions. There were very quickly, within the next year and a half after September of 87, there were 13 conventions. Well, Rhode Island eventually gets around to having theirs in 90. So there's a lot of, and those weren't secret. So I think there's looking at the state conventions and doing a little comparative work. How were they similar? How were they different? Another thing that struck me as in kind of emanating from Mike's comments, I wonder how much crisis and fear play into conventions happening. you know, I don't have any answer to this. So maybe students out there maybe look into was America truly at a crossroads of disappearing? I mean, that's what the Federalists said. Anti-Federalists wondered about that. But so all these other conventions in history, post-colonial, are there tremendous fears and crises in the mid 20th century with all of those conventions that happened. So, I mean, they're funny things. Most constitutions are just given to the people, either by a legislature or Solon, the philosopher kings. So they're unique things, and I think they're worth thinking about how unique they can be and how crisis and fear might play into that.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. I don't have much to offer to your recommendations and insights. I would like to remind our students and teachers, given that this is our first true episode of the season, that when it is posted and ready to view, that you can go to the button, and we do have a timestamp of all the questions that were asked tonight in case you just want to review a specific discussion, and we will have a sources spot in which we will provide a list of sources that are recommended to teachers and students for this question. So I think that's it for today. So until our next episode, peace, love, yogurt, tacos. Bye-bye. Bye, bots.